and second talk about this. As we saw last time, the vision of the future begins with a tour of a hatchery and conditioning center. And it avoids procreation, begetting, in favor of reproduction. And I think I talked about that, those three words. Did I talk about that in terms of that book, Begotten or Made? And the term reproduction, which we use for sexual, but it also applies to assembly line production and fits in more with the idea of a process, a mechanistic process, because we can reproduce things like photocopies and so forth. And yet, is it the same thing when we say we give birth to a person as it is to give a copy of ourselves? Well, firstly, if somebody exists as a twin or something, we say, well, you look exactly like that person. And yet the twins will say, but that's not me. And we'll say, well, you look exactly the same. Like, yes, but I am not that person. I'm totally different in many ways, although they'll see a lot of similarities. And they may even take advantage of the fact they look the same. There's lots of funny stories that twins will tell you about that. And it's there in Shakespeare, and it's there in C.S. Lewis, even in A Horse and His Boy, where the two twins play each other and deceive other people in the process and so forth. But here the advance towards reproduction is shown as an advance on the past, because it largely gives over to a greater human control of the process. And what I said that Brave New World particularly draws to our attention is the dehumanization that we already saw was characteristic of the Enlightenment's view of human nature, and the idea of utility and maximizing the greatest possible good, which is so much a part of utilitarian thinking and is so much a part of the North American mindset. I mean, it's very much a part of calculations even in churches. You know, what will be the best bang for the buck? You know, how do we avoid, how can we utilize our resources in a maximally effective way with the least possible consequences, considering them all to be equal, as if human nature were just one of the factors in the calculation. And even if we think of human nature, we'll think of it in terms of numbers, not in terms of qualities. And as I said in the class last time, the problem with this from a Christian perspective, although it's also even there in the ancient world, is that an individual is, particularly from a Christian point of view, has a soul which bears the image and likeness of God. And Jesus says that what matters it if the man gain the whole world but lose his soul? It's the most valuable thing you possess. It's of inestimable worth. So how then can you talk about it in comparison to numbers? It just doesn't seem to fit. And yet that's how we invariably do consider this. And note here, and this is interesting, the very idea of the hatchery and the way of reproduction here depends on a form of equality, which I don't think, if you don't think about it too much, escapes your notice. It's a biochemical equality. Like, it's one of the mottos of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. Everything done in the name of equality. And here we have equality, but it's equality in a biochemical form. So it starts off from the bare, considering human nature in its embryonic form, even before there is an embryo, in fact, considering the chemical makeup of an individual. And that biochemical way of looking at human nature is very much a part of the contemporary landscape. So I know many of you study psychology. And in psychology, the discipline is divided up into all different sorts of schools of psychology, most of which mutually exclude the others as a possible way of looking, scientific way at looking at the discipline. So for example, when I talk about the psyche, what do I mean by psyche in psychology? What do I mean by that? Do I mean the mind? Do I mean the brain? Do I mean the soul? Do I mean the feelings? I mean, what do I mean when I talk about the logi, the science of the psyche? What do I mean by that? And it depends on what you think human nature is beforehand, how you address that question. If you think that your thinking is connected to your brain chemistry, then you will address psychological distresses through brain chemicals. If you think a person is just the consequences of chemistry, then you will address problems chemically, biochemically. If you think that the person is a mind, then you will think of the person in a disembodied way, in which case you'll have a different problem. If you think of the person as a soul, then you often end up in the same problem with that of a mind, which is it's disembodied. Even though in biblical theology, a person's soul is more or less distinct, but still it has a body. To have a soul is to have a body in biblical thinking, not in classical thinking. In classical thinking, they think that the body's a prison house for the soul. But that's not Christian theology. Christian theology says that Jesus had a body, took on a body, and was subject to hunger and thirst and sleep deprivation and cold and death, and was raised bodily. The bodily resurrection is an important Christian theological tenet. So the idea of a soul that is not embodied doesn't fit with Christian theology. So then it again pushes you into the position, well, what do we mean by a psychological approach to the issue? It depends on what you mean by the psyche. And the schools that say the psyche's the brain are not just incidentally, but fundamentally opposed that say that the mind is what we're looking at, or the feelings. They're fundamentally opposed, and each of them claims to be scientific. How is that possible? You see the problem I'm talking about. It's the same problem in sociology, because again, they beg the question, what do we mean by an individual? What do we mean by society? Same thing with anthropology, by the way, which is the study of human beings in groups historically. But you still have to answer the question, well, what is a human being? Is it the mind? Is it the brain? Is it the soul? What is a human being? What are the characteristics of a human being? Here, in the hatchery of Aldous Huxley, it is a place where all people are physico-chemically equal and everybody's happy now, it says. How are they physically, chemically equal? They're all born in test tubes out of chemicals. And the inequality that arises from them is caused by the intervention of the hatchers, the conditioners, as C.S. Lewis calls them. And so people are conditioned by genetic engineering and electric shocks and hypnopadic repetition. So there's dreams that are presented to them in early childhood or even before they're born, to accept that they are the sum total of their identities, and to promote complacency and make them embrace the most simple desires, of which mostly they're eating and drinking and sex. The most simple desires, the ones that they share in common with animals. So to think of themselves that way. And in this world, people are sexually promiscuous. And so the phrase in Brave New World is, everyone belongs to everyone else. And if everyone belongs to everyone else, then you don't belong to yourself, in which case there is no such thing as a distinct individual that would have individual thoughts or have an appeal to notions of justice or injustice. I guess sexual assault doesn't happen because the person who is being approached is always willing. Although we will find in Brave New World that there are instances where it seems that abuse is going on. But the category of injustice and of having a limit to your individuality in which you don't want to admit other people doesn't seem permissible. It isn't even a thought. So the brave new world where everybody's happy and is one in which individuality is totally lost. And just think about that. As I said to you in 1936 last time, I couldn't get the date right, Wilhelm Reich, who's a cultural Marxist, writes these Sexualität im Kulturkampf, Sexuality in the Cultural Struggle, published in English as The Sexual Revolution. And the subtitle is Towards the Socialistic Restructuring of Humanity, based on Freud's connection of human nature to its sexual drives and desires. So it's first is attacking the current bourgeois sexual morality that says marriage is the venue for proper sexual interaction, and we want to undermine that. And the second is to try and promote this same sort of thing that we see here in Brave New World. So this is contemporaneous with Brave New World, this sort of speculation. And it takes place in a society where thinking about equality in biochemical terms is the way forward. And I think that it is the case to this day. Think of the language of the gender identity people. They talk about your identity assigned to you at birth, assigned at birth. You have no intrinsic nature. Even your sexuality is assigned to you by your parents or the doctor, but it's not part of your physical nature. You have no physical nature. It's your desires, and your desires are whatever you want them to be. It's entirely autonomous. It's driven by yourself. But the end effect of all this is, just like in Brave New World, that equality means that you lose your individuality. And the only sense that your individuality is affirmed is because everyone else has to agree with whatever you say at that point. So there's a sense of justice inserted into the whole process there. By the way, erotic experimentation in Brave New World begins at ages 6 to 8, just like in the sex ed curriculum. 6 to 8. But here it's explicit experimentation and takes place. And economically, in Brave New World, the consumers themselves have been commodified. So we think of consumers, the consumer society is a phrase, we consume things. But here it is we who are being made into the commodities. What's the difference between a product and the consumer of the product? If we are the product, think about what social media does to you. It creates an identity based on characteristics, and you become the product that the social media platforms are selling. They sell them to advertisers and they push things to you, but actually you are being sold to them, your biometric data. And AI then utilizes that. So now initially, when Huxley produced this, H.G. Wells, who was the great science fiction writer of the day, was upset and thought that Huxley had misrepresented the scientific future by presenting it so pleasantly and yet with such destructive consequences for humanity. He was disappointed by it, but with the benefit of decades thereafter, I think that Brave New World sounds entirely plausible. It sounds like a cultural commentary on today. By the way, and you notice that the year that is presented is the year of our Ford, not the year of our Lord, but the year of our Ford, reference to the Henry Ford and his assembly line of cars. And that means that history is irrelevant, just like in 1984. Henry Ford famously said history is bunk, because the meaning of history has already been accomplished. Reproduction. maximizing productivity on an assembly line basis. We've already achieved the aims of the Enlightenment in its ideal of progress: maximal bodily, biochemical pleasure, and even controlling human nature. I talked about the death of Ivan Illich and talked about death as something that he wants to avoid. But in Brave New World, we don't even see any instances of pain or deformity or crime or anguish or social discontent. Everybody's happy. Shiny, happy people everywhere. And even death is seemingly something that they avoid. The children are acclimatized to death palaces from the age of 18 months onward, encouraged to poke around and eat ice cream, while the dead are ushered off into oblivion eating soma and watching porn on TV. So death is all around them, and they get used to it, and they don't mourn it, because they're to the very end, the soma allows them an experience of titillation. They're distracted from it in that way. In Death of Ivan Illich, they want to avoid thinking about it. Here, they're so entertained that they don't consider it. And the chemicals from the corpses are used for fertilizer. So even the death is presented as a celebration of life. We can use the chemicals here for further growth. We can go on being socially useful after we're dead, says the character in this. We can make the plants grow. The title Brave New World is taken, by the way, from William Shakespeare's The Tempest, where it's the character of Miranda talks about the creatures on a utopian place, oh brave new world. And what's interesting is that Shakespeare is read only in the place where the savages operate. People don't read Shakespeare in Brave New World. They do read it where the savages are, but the portrait of life that it presents is wholly uninteresting to people who are living in the totally planned, managed, conditioned society. Comments or questions, observations? Let me go back to the book then. Oops. So chapter 1 was here. Oops. Get rid of the images here. I've looked at chapter 1 already. Let me go on to chapter 2 with Mr. Foster in the decanting room. Note the description here. Oops. What happened here? What did I just do? That was a mistake. Oh dear. This is the problem with doing this online. There it is. Infant nurseries, neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms. So you know the story about the Pavlov and the experiments. The dog that rings the bell, every time the bell rings, the dog gets food. And so Pavlov notices that what happens when you condition the dog to get fed after they hear the ringing of the bell is that the dog starts salivating because he expects instantly food. And that's what's going on here. The children get conditioned that when this happens, that happens. Now, this actually is effective with people, by the way. Classical conditioning does work. When I was in Florida, we went to SeaWorld, and they had these dolphins jumping and doing these spectacular things. But the dolphins come out and they get their fish immediately after it, like instantly. It's an instant reward because they're performing the trick to get the food. They're not even thinking about the trick. You have to introduce the trick into it, but they're really after the fish. When I do this, then fish comes. Oh, okay, but then I have to do this. Yes, okay, but they're just thinking fish. Whatever it is that prompts them to do the jump and flip in the air, it's fish reward. The children here are being trained in the same way. And note the word training here, and how we will talk about training in relation to animals, but we usually don't apply it to human beings. And yet here it's thoroughly being applied to human beings as if human beings were animals. Now, when I say that there's a reductionism here, the reductionism is total. And the same with the commodification of human being. So the director opened, though there was a large bare room, very light and sunny. The whole of the southern wall was a single window. And then he says, set out the books. The nurses obey the command. Now bring in the children, put them down on the floor. The infants were unloaded. Great phrase. Now turn them so they can see the flowers and books. Turn the babies at once, fell silent, then began to crawl towards the clusters of sleek colors. And they see all sorts of things that delight them. Excellent, he said. It might almost have been done on purpose. Swift as callers were already at their goal. Small hands reached out, uncertainly touched, gasped, unpedaling the transfigures rose. Then, watch carefully, he says, and lifting his hand, he gave the signal. The head nurse, who was standing by a switchboard at the other end of the room, pressed down a little lever. There was a violent explosion. You imagine little babies. They go up, oh, they're drawn by this, and then bang, shriller and even shriller, the siren shriek, alarm bells maddeningly sounded. The children started, screamed, their faces were distorted with terror, and now, the director shouted, for the noise was vectoring, now we proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock. Shocking babies. Okay, waved his hand, a second lever. We can electrify that whole strip of floor, bawled the director in explanation, but that's enough. Okay, offer them flowers and the books again. The nurses obeyed. Observe, observe. Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shocks. Already in the infant mind, these couples were compromisingly linked, and after 200 repetitions of the same or similar lesson would be wedded indissolubly. What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. Echoing the marriage vows. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. Okay, what the conditioners have joined, the connection of beauty with pain, is the way in which Huxley suggests exactly what Orwell also says. We're going to do it through pure brutality. Huxley says it'll be much more effective if we associate beautiful, good things with pain and make them want to avoid beautiful things. And furthermore, they'll grow up with an instinctive hatred of books and flowers. Remember, in 1984, they want to ban books and stop the reading of books. All they had to do was shock them every time they saw an image of a book, and they would never want to read another book. And then you replace that with a positive association, and you reinforce it in the same way, and exactly the same outcome. So that way you don't even have to ban words and so forth, because you've banished the whole of the language that is not related to the experiences that the child thinks about, and the childish experiences never get beyond childishness. We condition the masses to hate the country. In other words, the place outside the city. They want to live in the cities. But simultaneously, we condition them to love all country sports. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport, hence those electric shocks. I see, said the student, and was silent, lost in admiration. So we make them want to go to the countryside, but only if they go in a vehicle, and only if they enjoy it through a smartphone. We're going to go out on a trip to go see Muskoka. And this is a great day. And you're going to come along and you're really going to enjoy it. And immediately people pull out their phones and they're recording it all, they're watching it all. They can't experience it without the mediation of technology. They're being conditioned to do that. What's the psychological reward for using your smartphone in that situation? It's just an addictive impulse, quite frankly. You don't enjoy the sunset anymore. In fact, you can't enjoy it without the mediation of the technology. And the technology isn't, you're not just using the technology is commodifying you so that you're dependent on the technology. And then the social network will allow you to share it and other people make comments, and that reinforces the sense that you've done something good there. Same sort of thing going on. I see. There was a silence, then clearing his throat. Once upon a time, the director began, while our Ford was still on earth. No, our Ford, our Lord. There was a little boy called Reuben Rabinovich. Reuben was the child of Polish-speaking parents, the director interrupted himself. You know what Polish is, I suppose. A dead language. Like French and German, added another student, officiously showing off his learning. Oh yes, everyone's unlearned foreign languages. We only speak one language. And parent, says one. What's a parent? There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed. They had not yet learned to draw the significant but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. One at last had the courage to raise his hand. Human beings used to be... He hesitated. The blood rushed to his cheeks. Well, they used to be viviparous. Viviparous. Quite right, the director said approvingly. And when the babies were decanted, born came the correction. They don't use born anymore. The idea of a live birth, which was what viviparous is. You give birth, the mother gives birth to a child, that's a viviparous birth. And they don't use the word born anymore. By the way, the Ontario Families Act got rid of the word mother and father from Ontario law. They're no longer there in the legal code. It will now speak of parents, but you can have up to 4 of them, and they can be any 4 adults, and they can change over the course of time. That's Ontario legal code as of about 5-6 years ago. And again, gender assigned at birth. You're not born with characteristics that are part of your human nature. They're something that is seen as things that you choose, something that you can change, interchange, chemically, physically, because in the name of biochemical equality, we can do that without any assault on our human nature. And when the babies were decanted, born come the correction. Well, when they were parents, I mean, not the babies, of course, the other ones. The poor boy was overwhelmed with confusion. In brief, the director summed up, the parents were the father and the mother. The smut that was really science fell with a crash into the boy's eye, avoiding silence. Mother? He repeated loudly, rubbing in the science and leaning back in his chair. These, he said gravely, are unpleasant facts. I know it. But then most historical facts are unpleasant. These vulgar words, mother, father. He returned to little Reuben, in whose room one evening by an oversight his father and mother, crash, crash, happened to leave the radio turned on. For you must remember that in those days of gross, viviparous reproduction, children were always brought up by their parents and not in state conditioning centers. Oh, shock, horror. How vulgar. They've been taught to find the idea of families vulgar. The very idea of this, of giving birth, having a family, is a vulgar thought. It goes against everything they've been trained and conditioned to approve. And this principle of sleep teaching, or hypnopaedia, had been discovered. I'll skip over that. But you get the sense. So we go from the hatchery scene then to look at the children. And what we're getting here is the portrait of a brave new world from the beginning, from its embryonic or germinal phase, and then it slowly starts to spread out. So now we look outside the hatchery, and there are little boys and girls outside. How are they portrayed? Well, they're naked. They're all naked. It was playtime naked in the warm June sunshine. 600 or 700 little boys and girls were running with shrill yells over the lawns, or playing ball games, or squatting silently in twos and threes among the flowering shrubs. The roses were in bloom, and they looked for a time watching a game of centrifugal bumble puppy. I think it's some sort of strange sexual game in the circle. Not exactly here, but it's centrifugal. So 20 children were grouped in a circle around a steel tower, a ball thrown up so as to land on the platform at the top of the tower, rolled down in, and had to be caught. Strange to think that even in our Ford's day, most games were played without more apparatus than a ball or two and a few sticks and perhaps a bit of netting, like sports. Imagine the folly of allowing people to play elaborate games which do nothing whatever to increase consumption. It's madness. Nowadays, the controllers won't approve of any new game unless it can be shown that it requires at least as much apparatus as the most complicated of existing games. So it makes them more and more dependent on technology. Two books you should have a look at. One is Technopoly, and one is Amusing Ourselves to Death. Does anyone read either of these? Neil Postman, popular writer, journalist, two excellent books describing this same tendency and saying that it is characteristic of the modern world. It's the very thing that's portrayed as a dystopian future by Aldous Huxley, but Postman is describing American society in the late 20th century. Now, other characters are introduced to us here. We meet Lenina Crown, who's a rather promiscuous young woman, but then they all are. And I think she's a beta. We have Mustafa Mond here, who is one of the world controllers. I believe there are 10 of them. So he's one of the alphas of the alphas. And as they go on with this, you will find that the brave new world that ensues here is presenting a plot in which Bernard Marx, so one of the a psychologist, goes on an expedition with this young woman, Lenina Crown. And Lenina, he goes with her outside the world state to a savage reservation. So where are the people who are not conditioned, who are not in the presence of the urban center in which everything's not mediated through technology, and they basically live in families. It's viviparous. They have access to books. They live a life unmediated by artifice, so they live in the presence of nature, etc. And it's in New Mexico, and they observe two natural-born people, and they observe disease, they observe the aging process, they observe other languages, they observe other religions for the very first time, and it's like going to the zoo for them. They see these strange creatures that are people that have been born to a mother. And the culture of these resembles the Native American groups of the region. And they encounter a very vivid ritual. Now, I can't remember the chapter, unfortunately. But But Linda is a woman who was born in the world state, and she's now living on the reservation with her son, whose name is, what's his name again? What's the name of Linda's son? Oh, John, yeah. And she had gone there years ago and detached from the group and got pregnant by one of the people that were in the area there. And the person that impregnated her, I think, is Bernard's boss, the director of hatcheries and conditioning. And the reason she didn't return is because she was ashamed about the fact that she was pregnant. Because in the Brave New World, you don't get pregnant. You have ways of preventing the pregnancy from occurring, but she didn't have that with her, and she was ashamed about being pregnant, so she gives birth. And so she's a figure that occupies both the technological world of the Brave New World and also the savagery. But interestingly, the director of hatcheries and conditioning that we met right at the outset had sexual relations with her and knows that he has a son. And this is a scandal, because you're not supposed to have children by that means. And Linda and John's lives have been very hard and unpleasant. And to add further complexity to it, John has been taught by his mother to read. Shock horror. And she does it through a couple of books. One is a scientific manual. Another is the complete works of Shakespeare. And that means that John is only able to articulate his feelings in dialogue from Shakespeare. And so he sounds like he's a Shakespearean actor. So he's a savage, and yet he sounds about as educated as you'll never meet anybody that speaks in Shakespearean dialogue, but John speaks that way because that's the only conditioning he's ever had. And so it's a really interesting juxtaposition between the denizens of the Brave New World that read nothing and are considered to be educated and elite, not educated, but to be perfectly happy. And then you have John, who speaks with all the variety and emotional depth and character of Shakespeare's characters. And so he often quotes The Tempest, he quotes King Lear and Othello and Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. And John wants to go on an expedition to London, where his mother had come from. And so we've got two parallels going on here. So we have John and his mother, and then we have the denizens of the Brave New World that go back and forth, and they're like mirrors for each other. We call them foils. And what he wants to see is the Brave New World. So it's John's phrase that describes the world of London. He calls it a Brave New World, and in the same way, so he's like a Miranda. He's amazed at these creatures that have never been taught to read and are only interested in sex and pleasure. And he finds them disgusting and shallow and pathetic. So John, in a sense, becomes the hero of the story. And his response to the happy people of the Brave New World is instructive to the reader, I think. And when he comes back and he meets the director, he calls his father, unsurprisingly. But of course, in Brave New World, nobody is called father. It's a word that's become vulgar. And it makes everybody in the presence of John laugh that he's called him this. But of course, the director is then exposed for having a child, and he has to resign in shame. So the interaction between the two worlds is instructive in both ways. When they, as I say, when the totally conditioned characters go into the wilderness, they see people that have not been thoroughly conditioned. And likewise, when those people go back, they find them just as odd and strange. And so this is how Huxley helps us to look at different worlds. And note that he uses much of the same type of plot structure that not H.G. Wells, but George Orwell used. So you've got the conditioned nation, and then you have the place where the commoners live, and they carry on with their lives, and they're allowed to think as they want. So Bernard, who's brought back the Savage John, now has effectively got something along the lines of a celebrity, because this is the first savage that the people in the Brave New World have ever seen. It's like in the 17th century when native Indians of this country were brought to Britain, and they were presented to the Europeans and say, well, this is what an indigenous Canadian looks like. And they were introduced, and people would gather around and, oh, wow, look, different features, whatever. Same sort of thing is going on here. And the highest members of society are extremely interested in this creature named John. And he gets very happy with the attention, unsurprisingly. Even though at first he scorned the attention, he's delighted to have so much attention. And Bernard is also popular for a time because he's the host of this character. But he starts to become more envious because John becomes very much of interest to somebody that Bernard wants to get close to, namely Helmholtz Watson, who's an intellectual of sorts. And Linda, his mother, having not had the taste of soma for decades, suddenly experiences it, and she's just basically popping soma pills nonstop. And John, on the other hand, is repelled by the society and becomes more and more isolated, and he ostracizes himself by his behavior. He just doesn't fit in. And Lenina tries to seduce him, and he's repulsed by this. He hits her, and things start to degenerate. And eventually, John is forced to move away from this Brave New World. So anyway, that's the plot summary of it, more or less. What Huxley is suggesting here in the responses of John is how we ought to, I think, at any rate, how we, the reader, ought to respond to a Brave New World of the sort that we are being conditioned to want to like. And to think is a noble human ideal because it satisfies our bodily cravings and promotes the greatest possible good for the greatest number, if we look at that calculation biochemically, which we do to this day, by the way, now. We look at human life as a biochemical thing. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but at root, it's a biochemical reductionism, and it's a form of equality that goes below human nature. It's what we share in common with other animals. And you can really then condition it. If we are only so much chemistry, then you can train somebody chemically. So John is sent to an abandoned hilltop lighthouse, and he adopts a very ascetic lifestyle to purify himself of the Brave New World, which he found disgusting. And he starts whipping himself, self-flagellation, mortifying the flesh, and this draws a huge crowd of, first of all, reporters and eventually sightseers. They come out to see the man whipping himself because, of course, here he's not giving himself pleasure, he's giving himself pain. They've never seen anything like it. And when a documentary is produced of him whipping himself, suddenly the mobs come out here to see John, who wanted to purify himself of this. Now think about this in terms of the way Christianity sought to purify itself of the worldliness, and ascetics would go into the desert sometimes to escape the worldliness. John represents that sort of mindset, and yet here, the world that is conditioned, so conditioned towards pleasure, doesn't even see it as a renunciation of itself. It sees him as like a circus figure. Impossible to understand. And they demand, when they show up, that he whip himself for their entertainment. So again, if you compare and contrast it with 1984, there the big brother was willing to step on your face forever. Here, the crowds demand that people be abused, and they take delight in it. And one young woman emerges, and he whips her because he's just furious at the fact that he's become a circus spectacle. And the crowd is excited by this, and they're whipped into a frenzy, more or less. And an orgy ensued, fueled by soma, the drug. So it's basically a big drug party in which everybody, so it becomes sadomasochistic. And John is remorseful of this. The rest of them, of course, not. And John, in response to all this, decides to hang himself. And that's how the book finishes. The crowd, not so much. Now, the conclusion of this and the idea of John hanging himself in response to his remorse and guilt for what he did will remind us of Judas hanging himself. Well, why does John hang himself here? And what does he think has happened? We're not actually given access into his thoughts here. We're not told. We're just told that he hangs himself. But why? And what is Huxley trying to say with the conclusion of the book? It seems to me, and this is now speculative on my part, that he's saying that a sane person that has a sense of his moral integrity and is schooled in books cannot live in a brave new world, and yet will feel that and will inevitably be seduced by it and will end up taking his own life. So he loses his own sense of value by being compromised without any hope of redemption. There's no religious themes here whatsoever, at least overt ones. What were your thoughts on the book? Have you read Brave New World before? You did in school. What did you make of it? Did you see it as cultural commentary? Did you see it as futuristic, or did you see it as contemporary? I mean, it's obviously in the future because there are certain things that we don't possess and so forth, but the idea of hatcheries. But there are enough analogies there to make you think. There's a lot of similarities, and there are more similarities in our world now than when I read it a long time ago. First read it. Yep.
By carrying around these little tablets with them. So they were uncomfortable with anything. They would just
a happy pill.
Get high and forget about it.
Yep.
So, and unfortunately, yeah, we see a lot of that now, right? Where life is very unpleasant, but there's dispensary at every corner. So just
pretty much. So during the COVID-19 thing, the pot shops popped up on every corner, like that overnight. Extraordinary, all over the province. How is that possible? I mean, how is it even possible?
Yeah, they say they limited how many are allowed, but I can tell you that in Aurora, in like a 1 block or 2 block radius, there are like 4 pot shops.
Yeah.
All on the same street.
All on the same street. You ever seen anyone go in there?
Well,
I haven't. I never see anyone go in.
My daughter actually works at one.
Okay.
So it depends on the day.
Okay.
But some
Yeah, because I never see people go in. I wonder how they stay open.
Well, there's so many of them, right?
Well, even more so. How do you make a profit?
Yeah, like there's so many of them, right?
Like you have to rent the space. The space costs a lot of money. How do they break even? And yet none of them ever goes bankrupt.
Exactly.
How is that possible?
Evidently, they must all be making some money somehow, right?
Yeah, you wonder, but it's not from the sales of the. Yeah. So anyway. Yes. Welcome to Eden. I have not.
But they don't know that. So they're up against their will, and essentially you can't leave. If you attempt to leave, they kill you. And but there's this like, I don't know, drug or whatever it is, but like it's like this blue liquid that they give you, basically like liquid drugs. You don't remember anything.
Oh, so it has the benefit of getting rid of your memories, bad memories as well.
Yeah, because they can't tell what's real and what's not real. So
Oh.
things happen while they're like not really knowing what's going on. And but yeah, the cycle just keeps on growing. But there's, I don't know, there's just certain themes that kind of stood out to me from Brave New World that kind of.
I'm sure that Brave New World would have been read by the producers of the show or the writers and would be built upon, because this is a very influential work. Any other comments or responses? With respect to the entire course now, we've begun in the ancient world with Homer's Odyssey, with a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Whatever we want to attribute to the morality of Oedipus or Odysseus rather, he nonetheless has a sense of a nostalgia, a desire to return home, and the importance of that and of his family. It's at the center of his world. It's a microcosm of what's happening to him. His own kingdom is being destroyed while the man is being destroyed. And there's a sense of the importance of the family there, and the recovery of the family as part of his identity. When we come to the end of the course, we found that the family has no significance. In fact, it's not even a phrase that is used, that people are conditioned and hatched in factories, and they're titillated by means of pharmaceuticals. And they're, rather than Penelope holding off the suitors, the behavior that's encouraged is basically Penelope ought to not resist any of the suitors because everyone belongs to everyone else. Now, that's a biochemical form of equality that's got rid of justice in its traditional sense. And it's got rid of the importance of the family, and it's got rid of any sense of right and wrong, other than that of pleasure. And everything else becomes unthinkable. I conclude with this on the course, even though it's a rather negative way to conclude the course, but this is to some degree the world in which we live, and which we need to consider how to govern ourselves differently than according to the tenets of a brave new world, which we live in. How would you organize yourselves and live differently? Would you put off having children indefinitely? Would you think that having children is a violation of your human nature, or there's something obscene about it? As I say, in Ontario family law, the words mother and father are gone from family law, in which case the family has no legitimacy in the law. There's only individuals. And the individuals are not defined by anything other than being adults or children. Which seems to me to be a charter for abuse more than anything. Who's going to determine whether the people that call themselves the parents of the child are in fact parents of the child? If it's not a natural one, giving birth, then what is the relation of the adult to the child? How can we determine whether it's a just relation or a compassionate relation? I mean, what does the word compassionate or loving actually mean in the context outside the family? So the whole Christian categories of love and purpose and identity and justice, I would submit to you, need to be recovered to help make sense of people and prevent the ruining of lives. But that's not something we're going to solve on the course, but I think it's provoked by the way the novel Brave New World presents itself to us. Comments, questions, and if not, I'm going to conclude. Okay, well, I will conclude then. That's it.